They said he bought her for $1. A woman with a burlap sack over her head, standing silent in the dust. The men in town called him desperate. Maybe he was. Maybe he was just lonely enough to believe that kindness could still wear a human face. But when she finally spoke, her voice trembling through that rough fabric, what she said didn't just change his life. It shattered everything he thought he knew about love, shame, and the price of mercy. That's when the real story began. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The square of Dry Creek smelled of sweat and spilled whiskey, of dust that had learned to stick to shame, and Eli Mercer stood at its ragged edge like a man who had been hauled out by years of quiet losses, hat low, shoulders narrow, watching a transaction that felt like the town had finally sold its soul. A woman was bound to a post, her face hidden beneath a coarse burlap sack, her wrists hemmed red where rope had rubbed, and the auctioneer's voice rasped like an old saw through the heat as men who had names for themselves but not for their better angels bid with bitter grins. The crowd spat, children craned and were shushed, a drunk laughed too loud, and the sheriff, whose badge had long since become more habit than righteousness, slammed the gavel down and offered her up as if she were a beast, as if a human life could be reduced to a price scribbled on a ledger. The paper read $1, and at that number a ripple of cruel humor ran through the onlookers, faces folding into the kind of contempt that makes a person feel smaller and more heavy than the dust at their boots. Eli's hand, calloused, scarred from rope and reins, the hand that had once held a wedding band and a Bible, felt the weight of a single coin in his palm like a compass suddenly pointing a direction he didn't expect, and without the ceremony of choice he stepped forward and let that coin fall into the auctioneer's palm, the copper catching the sign for a breath before the world seemed to stop and the laughter hit a sudden thinness, like a thing stretched too far. The sack over the woman's head shifted, she flinched, but made no sound. The silence between them was thick, a rope wound of guilt and something that might yet be mercy. And in that stillness Eli realized he had done something no one in Dry Creek would name generous. They would call him desperate, foolish, soft, but he felt only a curious unmooring, as if the desert itself had intoed and, in the pause between breaths, given him room to do what a man with an empty barn and an emptier heart could not later explain. He led her away amid mutters and sideways looks, each step measured, the sack whispering against her neck, and the town's dust clung to their boots like an audience that refused to look away. He offered water from an old tin cup and she took it with slow, careful movements as if she were teaching herself to trust the world again. Though she did not remove the burlap, though she said nothing that first day beyond small murmurs that might have been prayer or pain. As he walked her toward the ridge where his cabin stood, a one-room place with a lean-to and a sagging porch, Eli's mind kept returning to the coin, to the last dollar in a pocket that had paid debts and fees in one unremarkable funeral, and he could not tell whether he had bought a woman or merely exchanged a single coin for the right to carry another's burden. The town would have their verdict, certain that a man who would spend his last on a nameless stranger had lost more than wealth. But Eli felt something else stir, a stubborn impatience with the cruelty that made people barter people, and a softer, stranger thing, hope, that maybe, in a place that offered so many endings, a single small act might be the beginning of something neither of them expected. Eli walked beside her through the scrub and scorched grass as the town's last silhouettes shrank behind them, the sack a dull, patient thing at her throat that swallowed the light and left only the sound of her breath and the rasp of his own spurs against leather. She did not fight, did not plead. Her hands trembled where the rope had marked them, fingers working at nothing, like a woman learning the shape of stillness, and the silence between them had weight, heavy as a ledger, full of unanswered questions that pressed against Eli's ribs with every step. The sun slid low and the world turned molten copper, their shadows stretched long and merged in the dust, tooth and ghosts crossing country no one in Dry Creek wanted to claim. And Eli found the small, practical comforts of habit doing what prayer could not, straightening the pack, checking the flank of the horse, offering a tired, dented tin cup when the woman nodded, the motion almost imperceptible, like a permission for him to keep being human. He watched the way she lifted the cup, deliberate, as if measuring the cup's edges for a map, and wanted to ask 1,000 things that would have been soft and useless against the sack. Who were you before they folded you into shame? What name did your mother call it on? But the questions turned to ash in his mouth. He'd learned the hard way that names in history sometimes dug graves. People in Dry Creek, like their stories, need an accusation, a verdict, a rope. The road was a ribbon of worn earth, lined with the occasional fence post and the leaning graves of homesteads that had vanished into rumor. And with each mile, the quiet between them grew less like a judgment and more like a companion's presence, awkward, unfamiliar, but enduring. Eli thought about the coin that had left his palm, a cheap, bright thing that had become a key, and wondered if coins could buy absolution or only entangle a man in debts the law did not reckon. The debt of looking another damaged person in the face and doing nothing, or the debt of choosing to stay when the world expected him to turn away. She hummed once as they crossed a dry wash, a sound so small it might have been a bird. It was not a tune Eli recognized, though there was something of lullaby in it, something that suggested a past of ordinary kitchens and warm bread rather than the ragged cruelty of a public sale. He remembered his own wife, Anna, how she'd braided her hair, how she'd scolded him for leaving a saddlebag open, how she'd sung as she mended the sleeve. That memory stung, a clean cut that never closed, and it made Eli's chest ache with the kind of longing that could twist into tenderness or bitterness depending on which way the wind blew. The woman, still faceless, still anonymous, moved with wary grace. Every now and then she would tilt her head as if listening for a sound only she could hear, and Eli found himself watching her hands the way a man watches a brand new colt, looking for the spark beneath the fear. He wanted to know if he had saved her or simply shifted a burden from the town's filthy hands to his own. Mercy can be a blind thing, an impulse to make the world less cruel that does not always reckon with consequences. So in the quiet he tried on both possibilities like old coats, feeling neither fit quite right. Night began to leak across the sky in slow, blue streaks. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and the first stars pricked like judgment or promise, depending on how a man felt about miracles. When they rounded a bend and the dark silhouette of his cabin appeared against the last brass of the horizon, the woman paused, and for the first time she lifted her chin as if measuring the place with a memory that did not belong to her. And in that pause Eli heard a whisper, not words, only the fragile sound of someone holding their breath before deciding whether to leave. He opened the gate, led her inside, and left the lamp unlit for a while. The cool of the cabin felt like an expiation and a rebuke simultaneously, and Eli stood with the sack between them, thinking that perhaps salvation in Dry Creek would not come from laws or pity but from the slower, harder work of keeping a person warm until they could find the courage to take their head from the shadow and name themselves again. The cabin creaked like an old confession, its boards swollen by years of heat and loneliness, and Eli Mercer stood in the doorway as the woman crossed the threshold, hesitant, deliberate, as if the act of entering another man's shelter carried its own brand of sin. She sat where he pointed, near the hearth, the sack still drawn low, and the lamplight painted her figure in shades of weary humility. Outside, the canyon wind moaned across the ridge, bending sage and brittle mesquite, but inside there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the hollow rhythm of two hearts trying not to notice each other. Eli busied himself with gestures that once felt natural, placing a kettle on the hook, folding a blanket over the chair, pretending that hospitality could fill the space where comfort had died, and he spoke the way a man speaks to his own ghosts, his voice calm but raw around the edges. He told her about the war years, about smoke and hunger, about the horses he'd lost and the brother who hadn't come back, about his wife Anna and the small garden she'd built from dry dust and stubborn prayer. He said these things because silence was too much like memory, and memory was too much like grief. Yet every word fell wrong, thudding into the air and hanging there unanswered, the way bullets sometimes stop short of their mark but still wound the shooter. The woman did not move, only sat with her hands folded in her lap, the coarse fabric of the sack turning gold and black with the fire's flicker. Sometimes she would tilt her head slightly, as though following the sound of his voice through fog, and Eli could not tell if she was listening or simply enduring him. He realized then that her quiet was not emptiness, it was armor, the only thing she still owned, and he felt foolish for trying to breach it with talk of his own miseries. The kettle hissed. He poured her tea and set it near her hands. She did not drink right away. Outside, a coyote yipped, sharp and lonely, and Eli's mind flashed back to the day Anna died, The way her last breath had sounded almost like forgiveness, almost like wind. He wondered what this woman had lost to make her so still. "You can rest here," he said finally, his voice low, his hands clasped behind his back. "Ain't much, but it's safe." The fire spat softly in reply, throwing sparks that curled and vanished. He thought of how absurd the situation must look. A man who had once commanded soldiers now speaking softly to a figure who would not even show her face. The woman's shoulders lifted once in a breath that might have been gratitude or exhaustion. And then she spoke, so quietly that Eli almost missed it. "Safe," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. And then after a pause, "Safe is what they said before they burned it down." Eli froze, the air tightening in his chest. Her voice was low and rough, but there was something inside it that scraped against his conscience, like the sound of a nail on an empty coffin. "What did they burn?" he asked, cautious. For a long time she said nothing, and then, with a faint tremor, she whispered, "Names get buried too." The words slid through the cabin like smoke, thin, poisonous, lingering, and Eli felt the hairs on his arms rise as if the temperature had dropped. The fire cracked loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and in that moment, Eli Mercer, war veteran, rancher, widower, felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He wanted to ask her what name she'd buried, what loss had carved her into silence, but something in the way she sat, straight-backed, unmoving, told him that to press her now would be to tear open a wound too deep to close again. So he let the silence return, heavy and holy, and sat across from her until the fire burned down to embers, the night pressing close around the cabin as if even the stars were afraid to listen to the truth that hung unspoken between them. Days drifted by like dust storms, slow, shapeless, and heavy, and in that passing silence, Eli Mercer began to learn the rhythm of the veiled woman who now shared his roof, her movements delicate as a shadow, her habits careful as someone who had lived too long on the edge of fear. She rose with the first light, moving soundlessly across the wooden floor, tending the small fire before he stirred, sometimes pausing to stare out the window as if the horizon itself might speak her name back to her. He noticed she never lingered near the mirror, never touched the sack that shrouded her face except to tighten its knots when the wind rose, and when she worked, washing a cup, folding a blanket, sweeping the porch, there was precision in her gestures, a kind of grace that belonged to a woman who had once known gentler days. Eli would sit at the table, pretending to whittle, watching her from the corner of his eye, wondering what it meant that she stayed without chains, that she moved within his walls like someone both grateful and condemned. Outside, the canyon wind carried whispers from the town, men at the general store saying his name with a sneer, women at the well clucking their tongues, the preacher calling it pity dressed as sin. He bought her. Like a mule, they'd mutter, their words slipping through Dry Creek like sand through fingers. Each time Eli went to town for flour or feed, he felt their eyes on him, some curious, some cruel, and though he tried to keep his jaw set, shame sat on his shoulders heavier than any saddle. But pity burned Hunter, a stubborn ache that told him maybe God still left room for small mercies in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. When he came home from those errands, she would always be there, sitting by the fire or mending something that didn't need mending, and the quiet between them was no longer oppressive but strangely companionable. Sometimes, when the wind slipped through the cracks, she would hum, a soft, broken tune that bent like the sound of a church hymn remembered halfway through a grief, and Eli would stop whatever he was doing just to listen. There was prayer in it, or memory, or both, he couldn't tell, but the sound pressed against the hollow parts of him until he felt his chest ache. Nights in the canyon were long, stitched together by the distant calls of coyotes and the ticking of the hearth as it cooled, and though Eli had slept soundly for most of his life, lately his dreams had turned restless, full of faceless figures and fires that would not die. One such night, he woke to another sound, faint, trembling, a woman sewed muffled by fabric and the weight of memory. He sat up slowly, heart pounding, and turned toward the small cot in the corner where she slept. The moonlight slid through the cracked shutter, washing over her as she twisted beneath the blanket, her body trembling as if fighting something unseen. Then came the words, small and raw, whispered through the sack like breath against a coffin lid, "Clara. Clara, no." Eli froze. The name struck him with a strange intimacy of a confession not meant for him. He wanted to wake her, to tell her it was all right, but something in the way her voice broke, half sorrow, half fear, stilled him. He sat there in the dark, listening as her breathing steadied, wondering if she had spoken to herself or to some ghost that still followed her. When dawn came, he poured her coffee and asked, softly, "You said a name last night." "Clara." "Who's that?" She paused, hands tightening around the cup, and though he couldn't see her eyes beneath the burlap, he felt the weight of her gaze. "Just a name," she said quietly. "One I shouldn't remember." Then she stood and went outside, leaving Eli staring into the fire, the name echoing in his head like a riddle carved into wind, and for the first time, he wondered if the woman in his cabin was haunted, or if she was the ghost herself. The storm came without warning, the kind that rises out of the desert like something alive, dragging the smell of iron and dust across the canyon as the sky folded in on itself. Eli had seen many tempests in his years, but none that cracked so sudden, none that felt so personal. The first bolt split the ridge with a blinding flash, lighting the land like a battlefield, and then came the rain, thick, heavy, relentless. Eli ran for the barn, boots sinking into the mud as he cursed under his breath, the wind clawing at his coat. Behind him, the woman followed, her figure bent against the gale, the burlap sack pressed tight against her face as if she could keep her secrets from being torn loose by the heavens themselves. Together they wrestled with the doors, the hinges screaming, the horses rearing and snorting with panic. "Hold it steady," Eli shouted over the roar, his voice nearly lost to the thunder. She didn't answer, but her small hands gripped the wooden beam with surprising strength. Rain poured down in silver sheets, and lightning flashed again, white, searing, illuminating the lines of her body as she strained beside him. The storm was merciless, shaking the earth, rattling the roof, and in one furious gust the wind ripped through the barn like a scream, catching the edge of the sack and snapping it backward. Eli's breath caught. For one endless heartbeat, the veil was gone. Her face was there, half in shadow, half in lightning, bruised along the cheekbone, a long scar tracing from the corner of her mouth down to her jaw, the kind of wound that told a story no one wanted to hear. Yet beneath the damage there was something startlingly gentle, a fragile beauty untouched by cruelty, the eyes dark and bright all at once, like a sky that refuses to stay stormless. She gasped, a sound sharp enough to pierce the thunder, and in the same instant she yanked the sack back down, fumbling, trembling, turning from him as if his gaze were fire. Eli stood frozen, breath heavy, heart thundering louder than the storm outside. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words died in his throat, drowned by the storm's fury and the shame he felt for having seen what wasn't his to see. Lightning forked again, throwing their shadows long against the walls, and the horses stamped nervously, their eyes wide and white. Eli reached for the latch, securing it at last, and then simply stood there, staring at the shape of her in the dimness, her hands clutching the edge of the hood like a sinner clutching a rosary. For a long moment, neither moved nor spoke, the air thick with the pulsive rain and the strange, unnameable thing that had passed between them. He wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that scars don't make monsters, but something deeper told him silence was kinder. Some truth need to rest before they can be held. So he picked up a lantern, adjusted the wick, and said only, "It's done." She nodded once, the gesture small but steady. When they stepped out of the barn, the rain had softened to a steady fall, the worst of the storm rolling east across the canyon, leaving behind a silver haze that smelled of wet earth and absolution. They walked back to the cabin without a word, side by side, their boots sinking into mud, their shoulders brushing once, accidental, yet enough to carry the warmth of understanding. Inside, the fire still glowed faintly, casting their reflections on the window pane, blurred by rain. Eli sat by the hearth, her figure visible in the corner of his vision, still cloaked, still quiet, yet somehow closer than before. The storm outside eased to a whisper, and in that fading thunder, he realized that whatever had broken loose in the wind hadn't just been her mask, it had been the distance between them. Something unspoken, fragile but real, now bound them tighter than words could ever dare. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The rain had eased into a whisper against the cabin roof, the storm's rage fading into the soft rhythm of dripping eaves, and Eli sat before the fire, his hands clasped loosely, the warmth painting his weathered face in flickering amber. Across from him, she sat on the low stool, shoulders drawn tight beneath the rough shawl, her shadow trembling against the far wall. For hours they had existed in silence, the kind that hums with unspoken thoughts, until at last her voice broke through it, low and brittle as burned wood. "You shouldn't have bought me," she said. The words were not accusation but confession, heavy with shame and a kind of disbelief that anyone would still bother. Eli didn't lift his eyes from the flames. "Didn't buy you," he answered quietly, his tone even but edged with something unyielding. "Just couldn't stand the look in their eyes." She said nothing for a while, her fingers working at the hem of her skirt as if unraveling invisible knots. The fire cracked, sending a spark into the chimney. "They said I owed them," she murmured finally, her voice unsteady. "Said the debt passed to me when he died." Eli looked up then, studying her through the shifting glow. "Your husband?" She nodded once, then movement so small it might have been a trick of light. "He was a man of pride and whiskey. He borrowed against the farm, against the stock, even against my dowry." When the fire came, her voice trailed off, breaking apart before the words could land. Eli leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Fire?" She drew a slow breath, steadying herself. "One night he came home mean, drunk. Said the land had beaten him for the last time. I tried to stop him, but he'd already struck the lantern. The barn went first, then the house. I ran back for the horse, for the deeds." She paused, her hands trembling. "He followed me with a shotgun. I don't remember pulling the trigger, but I remember the sound. I remember the light. Then, nothing but flames." The room seemed to shrink with her words, the fire in the heart suddenly crueler, too alive. "When they found me, they said I'd murdered him, that I'd burned it all to hide it." Her head lowered, the burlap still covering her face but failing to hide the quiver in her breath. "They took everything, even my name." Eli sat in silence, the weight of her story pressing against his ribs. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that no one had the right to trade her suffering like cattle, but the words felt too small for the damage she carried. The flames licked higher, shadows moving across her hands, scarred, delicate, human. He thought of the men in town, their laughter sharp and hollow, their cruelty disguised as law. Something inside him twisted tight, a coiled fury he hadn't felt since the war, back when injustice had worn uniforms and orders instead of smiles. "They said you owed him," he said slowly, "and they sold you to settle it." She nodded again, almost imperceptibly. "A debt that wasn't mine. But debts don't need truth, just signatures and witnesses. And there's no shortage of either in Dry Creek." Her voice faltered, but then steadied. "You should have left me there, Mr. Mercer. I'm nothing but trouble that won't stay buried." Eli looked into the fire, its light dancing in his tired eyes. "Trouble's got a different face in every town," he said after a long pause. "But cruelty looks the same wherever you go. Maybe I just got tired of watching it win." The wind outside rose for a moment, whispering through the canyon like an old ghost, and the fire dimmed as if listening. For the first time in years, Eli felt anger, not for himself, not for what life had taken, but for her, for every woman and man whose pain had been turned into currency. He met her hidden gaze and spoke softly, like a vow, "Ain't no one paying for you again." She didn't reply, but her shoulders eased the faintest bit, and in that fragile quiet, it felt like the storm outside had finally learned to rest. The dawn came pale and heavy, dragging its light over the canyon like an old blanket, and when Eli stepped outside to saddle the horse, he found her already standing by the fence, shawl wrapped tight, the burlap still veiling her face but her posture steady, as if she had already made peace with what waited beyond the ridge. "There's something I need to show you," she said, her voice low and even, and though Eli didn't ask where, he saw the answer in the way she glanced east, toward the barren stretch of land where smoke sometimes rose from memory alone. They rode without speaking, the sun climbing slow and merciless behind them, turning the desert to fire. The path narrowed into dry gullies and twisted rock, and Eli's horse snorted nervously, hooves cracking over the scorched ground. When they crested the final hill, the land below them looked like a scar, the remains of a homestead, blackened beams jutting from the earth like gravestones, the soil still charred after all those months of wind and rain. She dismounted first, her boots sinking into ash, and for a moment Eli thought she might fall to her knees. Instead, she walked forward, slow and certain, until she reached the center where the hearth had once stood, a few stones still clinging to their shape as if they refused to forget they'd once held warmth. Eli followed, saying nothing. The smell of smoke lingered faintly, buried deep in the dirt, and he could almost hear the echo of flames crackling, the ghost of a life undone. She stopped, lifted her chin toward the ruin, and spoke with a steadiness that trembled beneath its surface. "They said I killed him," she began, fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "Said I struck the match, that I wanted him dead for the debt he brought. But I didn't. I ran when he tried to kill me first." The words hung between them, too clean, too real. Eli felt his jaw tighten, the desert wind slicing between them like judgment. "He hit me that night," she went on, voice thinner now, "said I was no wife, but a curse. I tried to take the ledgers, the deed, proof the land was mine before his gambling took it. He laughed, called me a liar, and when I reached for the papers, he raised the lantern. I don't remember how it fell. I just remember fire, his face through the smoke, shouting that I'd burn with him. I ran till my lungs swore." She fell silent, her hands shaking now. Eli crouched near one of the beams, blackened but still faintly smelling of pine, and sifted a handful of soot through his fingers. It stuck to his skin like gild. He looked up at her, her figure framed against the endless desert, small and unyielding, and he realized that truth was not a clean thing. It clung, it scarred, it demanded to be carried. "You shouldn't have had to run," he said quietly, the words tasting like dust. She shook her head, a bitter smile behind the burlap. "The law don't care about what shouldn't be. Out here, they see a woman and a corpse, and that's all the story they need." Eli wanted to argue, to tell her that wasn't how it had to be, but he knew better. The West had its own scripture, written in blood, amended by fire, and it rarely forgave those who tried to write their own chapter. The wind picked up, scattering ash across their boots. "I thought maybe if I brought you here, you'd understand," she said softly. "You saw the kind of mercy this land gives." "None at all." Eli looked at the ruin again, the remains of someone's home, someone's sin, someone's love, and something shifted inside him. Not quite pity, not quite righteousness, but something harder, conviction. He stood, brushed the soot from his hands, and said, "There's truth buried here, sure. But it ain't yours alone. Maybe it's time somebody else carried some of it." She turned toward him then, and for the first time since they'd met, she didn't bow her head. The wind howled through the ruin, and Eli thought that maybe the land had heard her confession, and would keep it, the way deserts keep bones, quietly and forever. The sun was sinking behind the ridgeline, casting the desert in the color of dying embers when Eli and the veiled woman turned their horses back toward Dry Creek, the scorched homestead shrinking behind them until it was nothing more than a shadow in the haze. The air felt heavier now, charged with something neither of them dared name. They rode slow, the hooves crunching through grit and silence. The only sound between them was the creak of leather and the dry whistle of wind threading through mesquite. Eli tried to focus on the rhythm of the ride, the sway of the saddle, anything but the memory of her voice breaking in front of the ruins. She'd told him her truth, and now he carried it, like a brand pressed into skin. But the West was a cruel land for truth. It had a way of twisting it until mercy looked like guilt and survival smelt like sin. As they neared the main road, something white flickered against the fence post ahead, a scrap of paper nailed draft, flapping in the wind. Eli's horse shied a little as they approached. He leaned forward, squinting at the faded ink. At first, it was only words he saw. Wanted, murderous Clara Hawthorne, alive or dead, reward $200. Then came the drawing, sketched by a hand that had never met a woman but somehow captured all the cruelty the world believed her capable of. The eyes were too dark, the mouth set in defiance, the lines sharp where softness should have been. It was her face, distorted, branded by rumor and ink. Eli's breath caught in his throat. The name hit him harder than the bounty itself. Clara Hawthorne, the widow of Black Mesa. He'd heard the name whispered in saloons, spat in train stations, told around campfires like a ghost story. They said she'd burned her husband alive, shot a deputy, fled through the desert with blood on her hands and no tears to spare. He'd thought it was legend, one of those tales meant passed around to fill the silence between poker hands. But now, the legend sat on the horse beside him, wrapped in burlap and bone-deep quiet. The paper fluttered again, snapping like a snake's tongue in the wind. He tore it down before she could see, meaning to hide it, but she was already looking. Her shoulders stiffened. The wind caught her hood, pressing the fabric tight against her face, and for a heartbeat he thought she might bolt, kick her horse and vanish into the canyon where no lawman could follow. Instead, she reached out, slow, steady, and took the poster from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, trembling but not weak. She looked at it for a long moment, tracing the lines of the drawing with a touch that seemed almost tender, as if studying someone she'd once known but no longer recognized. "Now you know," she whispered. Her voice was quiet but hollow, emptied of surprise. Eli didn't answer. He couldn't. The words tangled in his chest like barbed wire. He wanted to say he didn't care, that what mattered was the truth she'd told him by the ashes that morning. But something about seeing the name, seeing her hunted by ink and law, made speech impossible. The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of the paper, but she didn't let go. Finally, she folded it once, twice, neat and deliberate, and handed it back to him. "Keep it," she said. "Reminds you what I am." Her tone wasn't bitter. It was tired, resigned, like a woman had already lived her trial 100 times. Eli tucked the paper into his coat, where it pressed cold against his chest. He wanted to burn it, to let the smoke carry it away, but he knew it wasn't that easy. Some things had to be carried. They rode on without another word, the wind hissing through the grass like gossip. Above them, the sky bruised into twilight, and Eli's mind churned between justice and mercy, truth and the law. He looked at her silhouette, small, steady, unbroken, and thought, maybe the stories were never about her sins, but about the world's hunger to see a woman punished for surviving. The news of the bounty doesn't travel by word so much as by wind. It slips through cracks in the saloon doors, drips into whiskey glasses, rides the dust between boots and broken fences, and by the time the sun was high over Dry Creek, the name Cole Grady had already hung itself across every whisper. He rode in from the east, black coat stiff with trail dust, a man carved from the same cruelty he hunted. Folks said he dragged 20 men back to justice and twice as many to their graves. Law was a tool in his hand, but death was the trade that kept him warm at night. His horse, a scarred black gelding, carried the weight of shackles in memory, and when he stepped off it, the town seemed to shrink around him. The sheriff didn't bother pretending hospitality. He just pointed toward the ridge and muttered something about a man named Eli Mercer, a woman he shouldn't have. Grady nodded once, said nothing, and flipped the silver star on his vest just enough to catch the light. He didn't need maps. Men like him followed scent, instinct, and fear, and Eli Mercer had all three. At the ridge, Eli felt it before the sound reached him. The faint rhythm of hooves, steady, patient, purposeful, threaded through the canyon air like a pulse. He was mending a fence when the first echo drifted in, and though it was still miles off, something deep inside him tightened. Clara was at the porch, shelling beans into a wooden bowl, the burlap hood still shadowing her face, and she noticed the change in him, the way his shoulders squared, the way his gaze lingered too long toward the horizon. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. She didn't ask who. She already knew. The air seemed to grow thinner between them. The horses in the barn shifted restlessly, stamping the dirt. "How many?" she asked. "One," Eli answered, but his voice was distant, like a man talking to memory. She set the bowl aside and stood, the sack fluttering slightly with the wind. "You don't have to save me," she said softly. "No one ever does." Eli turned then, and though she couldn't see his eyes, she could feel the weight of them, steady, fierce, the kind that burned hotter when the odds went bid. "Maybe it's time someone did." His tone was quiet but final, the kind that didn't leave room for argument. He went inside, took down the old rifle from above the hearth, checked the chamber out of habit, and ran a thumb along the worn stock. It had seen war once, and mercy none. Outside, the light was turning copper, the sky folding into dusk. Clara stepped closer to him, her voice trembling just enough to betray the fear she'd buried so deep. "If you kill him," she whispered, "they'll send another." Eli's jaw clenched. "Then I'll bury another." The wind rose, carrying the scent of sage and rain, and for a moment, neither of them moved. She wanted to tell him not to waste himself on a lost cause, that her name was already a death sentence no bullet could erase. But there was something in the way he stood, calm, rooted, unflinching, that made her stop. He wasn't fighting for her out of pity. He was fighting because somewhere along the way, her story had become his reckoning too. Down below, the first faint silhouette appeared on the road, a rider moving with the certainty of a man who had never turned back. The sky darkened, swallowing the last of the light. Eli loaded the rifle, slow and deliberate, the click of the metal echoing in the cabin like a clock counting down. "Get inside," he said. She hesitated, then obeyed, her steps slow, her breath quick. When the door closed behind her, he stepped out into the open air, rifle resting against his arm, the dust swirling around his boots. Somewhere down the ridge, Cole Grady smiled beneath the brim of his hat, as if he could already taste the bounty in the wind. Two men now rode toward each other, one for blood, one for redemption, and between them stretched the thin, trembling silence of a world that never learned the difference. The night was restless, carved in amber and shadow, the air thick with the scent of sage and storm that had yet to break. The sound of a lone coyote drifted across the ridge, then faded into the kind of silence that makes a man's thoughts loud. Eli sat by the hearth, his rifle propped beside him, his hands clasped together as though in prayer, though his eyes were fixed on the fire, the orange light bending and twisting like truth refusing to stay still. Clara sat across from him, her figure still and small, the burlap sack veiling her face, her fingers interlaced in her lap. Outside, the wind had died down, but Eli could feel the pressure of something gathering, violence, confession, or maybe grace. Neither spoke for a long time. The wood popped, sending a thin spray of sparks into the air, and Eli's shadow moved across the wall, long and weary. Finally, she stood, slow and deliberate, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, stripped of fear but not of pain. "You should turn me in," she said. Eli looked up, his brow furrowed, but she didn't wait for him to answer. Her hands rose to the burlap, fingers trembling as they found the knot. "You could buy your soul back. Maybe there's two." The knot came undone, and the sack fell away, landing softly at her feet. The firelight caught her face, the scars, the burns that traced the memory of flame, the bruises that had long since faded into pale ghosts on her skin. Yet beneath all that ruin, her eyes were gentle, startlingly alive, like something in her had refused to die even when everything else had begged for it. Eli didn't flinch. He had seen too much in war to mistake brokenness for ugliness. Instead, he looked at her with something steady and wordless, recognition, maybe, or forgiveness in its truest, simplest form. "Don't need buying," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of miles and mistakes. "Just need peace." She shook her head, the hint of disbelief softening her mouth. "Peace doesn't come to people like me." "Then maybe I'll meet you halfway," he replied, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled, a small, weary curve of the lips that reached his eyes. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air charged, the fire throwing its restless light over both of them as if testing whether warmth could still exist between two souls burned down to ash. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "If he finds you, Grady, he'll kill you for sheltering me, for pitying me. And if you kill him, there'll just be another. There's always another." Eli leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Then let him come," he said. "Ain't running from men like him anymore. Spent half my life doing that, running from what I should have stood for." The words landed between them with the quiet authority of conviction. She stared at him, and something fragile in her began to shift, like ice thawing after a long, cruel winter. Hope was a dangerous thing. She'd buried it once before, deep enough she thought it would never grow back. But now, watching him, she felt it stir. The fire snapped loudly, as if the world itself had paused to listen. The light danced across their faces, softening scars, blurring the edges of despair. Slowly, she stepped closer, her shadow merging with his. "You're a fool, Eli Mercer," she whispered. "Maybe," he said, his voice barely more than breath, "but at least I'll be a fool who tried." For a moment, neither moved. Then she reached out, her fingertips grazing his hand, hesitant at first, then sure, and the air between them filled with something ancient and trembling. A wordless understanding that sometimes redemption doesn't come from salvation, but from the choice to stand beside another soul when the world turns away. The fire cracked again, flaring bright, as if even the flames had leaned in to watch what would become of two people who had nothing left but courage in each other. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The dawn came cruel and clear, the kind of morning that seemed to sharpen every shadow and harden every sound. And when Eli stepped outside, the horizon was still a bruise of pale golden violet, the wind whispering through the sage like a warning. The first thing he saw was dust rising in the east, a single rider cutting through the plain, the glint of metal catching the newborn light. Cole Grady rode like judgment itself, calm and steady, a man without hurry because he'd never needed it. Death had always waited for him. The revolver at his hip gleamed even from a distance, polished like a promise. Eli's hands were steady, though his heartbeat wasn't, fast and uneven, thudding in his ribs like the hooves drawing closer. Behind him, inside the cabin, Claire watched through the crack of the door, the sack long gone now, her face bare and trembling in the fire's fading glow. "Step aside, Mercer," Grady called as he drew near, his voice low and certain, the kind of voice that didn't ask, it decided. Eli said nothing. The wind carried the scent of dust and gun oil. "Ain't your fight," Grady continued, stopping just short of the porch. His horse pawed at the ground, impatient. "She's worth more dead than what you got left in that cabin. You hand her over, and maybe I'll forget your name before supper." Eli's fingers brushed the worn stock of his rifle, then fell away. He stepped forward, slow but sure, the boards creaking beneath his boots. "Don't think I'll be handing anything over today." Grady tilted his head, studying him. "You got no badge, no debt, no cause. What's she to you?" Eli's throat worked once before he spoke. "She's human." The words were simple, quiet, but they hit the space between them like a strike of flint. For a long moment, nothing moved. The morning light stretched long across the dust, the air heavy with the weight of two men who knew exactly what would happen next. "Last chance," Grady said, his hand lowering to his gun. Eli took another step forward, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. His voice was steady, but there was something fierce in it now, something old and tired of compromise. "You're standing on my land, Grady. Best walk away while you still can." The bounty hunter's smile was a thin, cruel line. "You talk like you've still got time left to spend." Then his hand moved, fast, precise, practiced. The revolver cleared leather in a blur of silver and smoke. The first shot cracked the dawn wide open, echoing across the canyon like thunder. Eli staggered back, the bullet finding his side just beneath the ribs, heat and pain bursting through him in the same breath. He didn't fall. Not yet. His own rifle came up, slow but sure, and before Grady could cock the hammer again, Eli fired once. The sound was raw, final. Grady's head jerked back, his hat spinning into the dust, and his body hit the ground with a dull thud, the revolver slipping from his hand, the barrel still smoking. For a moment, the world went still again. Even the wind seemed to stop. Clara's scream broke it, sharp and trembling, and she was suddenly at his side, her hands catching him before he could fall. Eli looked down at the wound, dark, wet, spreading, but his eyes stayed on the horizon, where the first real light of morning was breaking free. "It's done," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it to. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mingling with the scent of blood and sage. Claire pressed her hands against his wound, frantic, pleading, but Eli only smiled faintly, his breath shallow. Around them, the dust began to settle, the sun climbing higher over the ridge, painting everything gold, the dead man in the dirt, the woman in tears, and the fool who'd finally stopped running from what was right. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and morning dew as Clara fell to her knees beside Eli, her hands already slick with his blood, pressing desperately against the wound that wouldn't stop leaking life into the dirt. Her breath came in broken gasps, part sob, part prayer, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Why do you do it, Eli? Why do you do it?" But the answer came with a faint, weary smile, his lips pale, his eyes still bright in the dawn's half-light. "Guess kindness costs more than $1, he said. His voice cracked but soft, almost amused, and for a moment she thought he might laugh again. But his chest rose shallowly, then slower still, each breath a whisper of the man who had stood so tall against everything cruel in the world. She pressed harder, her tears streaking the dust on his face, her hands shaking so violently that the blood smeared across his shirt looked like the ruin of a sunset. "Stay with me," she begged, her words trembling against the wind. But Eli's gaze had drifted past her, toward the ridge where the light broke clean in gold, spilling over the canyon like a promise. His lips moved again, a faint murmur that might have been her name, or maybe just the sound of peace finding its way back into him. Then silence, only the wind, the rustle of sage, and her soft, trembling prayers that sounded more like apologies than faith. She bent forward, pressing her forehead to his, whispering fragments of hymns her mother used to hum, the ones meant for the dying but always sung by the living. "You didn't have to," she said through her tears. "You didn't have to." But deep down, she knew he had. Eli Mercer had been a man haunted by ghosts too long to walk away from one still breathing. Around them, the world continued as if nothing had changed, the wind sighing through the canyon, the sun climbing higher, birds scattering from the sound of grief. Clara didn't know how long she stayed there, kneeling in the dust beside him, the warmth slowly fading from his skin, her own heartbeat roaring in her ears like a punishment. The blood had dried dark across her hands when the first voices reached her, shouts from the road, the sharp clatter of hooves, the townsfolk arriving too late to stop what had already been written in the dust. She didn't look up until she heard the sheriff curse softly, his voice breaking through the stunned quiet. "Mercer," he breathed, disbelief and regret mingling in the single word. The others, men who'd mocked, women who'd gossiped, stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, watching the scene unfold. The dead bounty hunter sprawled like a broken idol, the widow with her hands red, the man who'd bought a stranger for $1 now lying cold with peace carved into his face. Claire lifted her head slowly, and in that motion, the morning light caught her fully, the burlap sack gone, her face bare to the world. The scars, the burns, the marks of all she had survived, glowed golden under the rising sun, no longer grotesque, only human. There was defiance in her eyes, yes, but something purer too, grief that refused to hide. None of the townsfolk spoke, they only stared, caught between pity and shame, because in that moment, the story they had written about her, the murderess, the fugitive, the sinner, crumbled under the simple truth of what they saw, a woman kneeling beside the only man who'd ever believed she was worth saving. The sheriff removed his hat and bowed his head, the others following, awkward, uncertain, reverent. Clara's lips moved again. One last prayer carried by the wind, her voice faint but steady. "Rest now, Eli Mercer," she whispered, her tears falling into the dust that would soon claim him. "Your debt's paid." The wind rose one last time, carrying his faint laugh into the dawn, soft, lingering, and then gone, swallowed by the silence that comes after mercy has exacted its price. Weeks folded into themselves like pages in an old Bible, and the ridge kept its silence as if it had been holding its breath for this very moment. Clara worked with hands steadier than she felt, digging into earth that had once been only dust beneath Eli's boots, the lone oak gossiping with the wind as if every leaf were a witness. And when she finally lowered his body into the shallow grave she had dug herself, there was no sermon, only the honest, ragged work of burying a man who had chosen to carry her shame into his last breath. The sheriff came up the path later, hat in hand, the town's curiosity trailing behind him in the form of a few reluctant onlookers who stood far enough away to hide their judgment but close enough to feel the weight of it. He found the bounty poster torn in half and stuck in the dirt beside the grave, the ink flaking like old guilt, and he did not know whether to be relieved or ashamed to be part of a law that had allowed such an injustice to be bartered in a public square. Clara wrapped Eli's old coat around his folded hands, clasped the small coin, the $1 that had bought her from a crowd's cruelty, on the lid of the box as if to mark a price paid in full or perhaps to mock the absurdity of putting worth into copper. And when she stood back and looked at the rank of headstones and markers that dotted the ridge, her shoulders, once stooped under the weight of a nameless past, seemed to find a new, terrible steadiness. No one in Dry Creek spoke the way they had used to. The gossip that used to be sharp and certain softened into something that felt more like apology disguised as rumor. Men who had snickered now averted their eyes. The women filled the grocery windows with cascaroles and wet pies and stories that changed with each telling. Some claimed she had been his wife all along, that the sack had been a symbol of a bargain between two souls. Others said Yulai had been killed by a jealous relative and that Clara had shot in defense. And out on the road wagons rolled with fresh whispers that stitched each lie into legend until the truth, messy, human, full of ash and recoil, slid quiet as a stone to the bottom of whatever well the town kept for inconvenient facts. The sheriff, uneasy and human, did what a man with a conscience and insufficient courage would do. He left the torn poster where it lay but did not press charges, and when asked for a statement he offered only. He did what he thought was right, which was both least and most of what could be said. In the weeks that followed, people came to the ridge not because they were seeking to judge, but because grief mixed company of even the meanest hearts. They left flowers, withered, wild, and sometimes ill-placed, on Eli's grave and murmured the name they'd once used as a punchline now like a prayer. Clara Mercer. And though she kept to herself, tending the small patch of soil with a reverence that was almost workaday, the community's sharp edges dulled into a cautious respect. Rumors did what rumors have always done. They dressed truth in the garments of whatever people wanted, some craving comfort, others a hero to idolize. But over time this story smoothed into something easier to hold. A lonely cowboy, broken and brave, who spent his last dollar to rescue a woman who'd been reduced to a piece of currency, and who then gave his life to keep her free. Children heard the softened version at the schoolhouse and repeated it with the part about the dollar as if it were a moral. And the saloon man, less boisterous now, spoke of Eli not as a fool but as a man who'd remembered how to be kind when kindness was cheaper to keep than pride. Clara never claimed the neat, gilded versions of the tale. She kept the burlap sack in a trunk at the back of the cabin, folded but not burned, a relic of what she had been forced to wear and what she had been taught to hide. And sometimes at night she would sit by the window and touch the coin in her pocket, feeling its rim like a small, stubborn anchor. The oak above Eli's grave grew a little taller every season, leaves catching the sun and throwing slanted light across the headstone. Folks walking the ridge would pause, look up, and feel something settle in their chests, as if the land itself had accepted a different accounting of worth. In time, truth and tale braided into something gentler. People told of mercy paid in copper, of a man who refused to let a woman be owned by rumor. And so Eli's last act became a small legend, a story dry enough to be told in the doorway of a bar but honest enough to quiet the conscience of anyone who'd once cheered at another's shame. Clara kept on living, not by forgetting what had been done to her, but by tending to the life Eli had given space to begin. A life that included slow morning walks, helping neighbors with mending and seed, and, when the wind was right, coming ahem. They had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with the particular kind of peace two people can find when mercy has been paid and a grave has been dug on a hill that remembers who stood there last. The cabin smelled of smoke and cedar, the same way it had the night Eli last sat by the fire, and when Clara stepped through the door weeks after laying him beneath the oak, the silence greeted her like an old friend, soft, watchful, familiar in its ache. The dust had settled across everything he touched, the chair by the hearth, the rifle on the wall, the tin cup by the sink, and yet nothing felt abandoned. It felt as though he might return any moment, hat in hand, saying nothing but meaning everything. She moved carefully, tracing the edges of his life with her fingertips, brushing away dust not out of need but reverence, until her eyes fell on the table where his worn Bible sat, its pages warped and yellowed by years of desert air. Something inside her tugged, and with trembling hands she lifted it, a faint puff of dust rising like a sigh. Beneath it, folded with deliberate care, was a small piece of paper, edges frayed, the kind of note written by a man who didn't waste words because he'd already spent too many in silence. She unfolded it slowly, the paper soft with age, and read in his uneven scroll, "If you ever find peace, keep it. Don't let the world take it from you again." The words were few, but they carried the weight of everything Eli had ever been, every battle fought, every sorrow endured, every moment he'd chosen mercy over the easier cruelty of indifference. Clara's hand shook as she traced the ink, her tears falling before she could stop them, dotting the page like tiny signatures of grief. She pressed the note to her chest, the smell of paper and dust mixing with salt and memory, and for a long time she stood there, the fire long cold but the warmth of his presence flickering somewhere deep inside her. When she lowered the note, her eyes caught something else, something small and silver glinting in the weak light near the folded pages of the Bible. It was a ring, simple and worn, the metal dulled by years but still carrying the faint outline of a pattern, a band that once belonged to his wife, Anna, whose name he had spoken with quiet reverence and sorrow those first nights they shared the cabin. For a moment, Clara hesitated, her reflection quivering in the metal, as if the world were asking her whether she dared take what wasn't hers. But then she remembered the way Eli had looked at her, not as a ghost of his past but as something living, something worthy, and she realized he had left this not as a possession but as a benediction. Her fingers slipped it onto her hand, the ring settling against her skin like something meant, something earned, and she felt a strange, quiet strength bloom in her chest. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon, brushing against the cabin walls with the soft insistence of a whisper, and for the first time, she let herself breathe without guilt. The past, the fire, the sack, the weight of every cruel word, was still part of her, but now it felt smaller, framed by the space Eli's kindness had carved out around it. She turned toward the small mirror near the hearth, its glass fogged and cracked, and for the first time she saw not a fugitive or a sinner, but a woman standing steady in the light. "Clara Mercer," she said quietly, testing the sound of it, and the name felt both strange and right, like something she had carried all along but only just found the courage to claim. The words lingered in the air, soft but unyielding, and in the faint reflection, she thought she saw Eli behind her, smiling, just a flicker, just long enough for her to believe that perhaps he had never really left. She placed the note beneath the Bible, smoothing it flat, then sat by the fire that wasn't lit and closed her eyes, the rain cool against her skin, the peace she had wished for her settling at last where her sorrow had lived too long. Outside, the day broke bright and golden across the ridge, and the oak tree swayed gently as if nodding in quiet agreement that redemption, once found, could finally stay. Years drifted by like dust along the canyon rim, soft and relentless, carrying stories the way the wind carries seeds, some true, some not, all finding places to root in the minds of those who passed through Dry Creek, that small, stubborn town that still clung to its stones and secrets. And though the saloon's paint had peeled, the church bell had cracked, and the desert had swallowed half the fence posts, one thing endured: a widow who lived alone by the ridge, where the oak grew tall above a single grave marked only with the words Eli Mercer, a kindness remembered. Travelers who took the North Trail swore they could see her from the road, a solitary figure moving among the stones, her gray hair braided and her hands rough from work, her shadow long in the sunset. They said she kept the graves clean, even those of men who hadn't earned her mercy, placing wild flowers at their headstones when spring allowed. Some nights, when the wind rose just right, people in town would stop what they were doing and listen. Through the rustle of leaves and the sigh of sage, they'd hear her humming, low, steady, sorrowful, the same tune she'd once sung to herself in a stranger's cabin before the world learned her name. No one knew the words, but it was said the sound carried across the canyon and settled over Dry Creek like a benediction. Folks argued about her story, of course. Some claimed she still wore the burlap sack when she prayed, that she'd kept it as penance, kneeling beneath the oak with the rough fabric draped over her face, whispering to the man who'd given his life to save hers. Others insisted they'd seen her burn it long ago, the flames rising behind the cabin, bright as sunrise, her voice clear and strong as she sang something that sounded like goodbye. A few swore they'd spoken to her once, that she'd smiled and offered water, her eyes kind but far away, as if she were still living half in another world. The children of Dry Creek, who loved a ghost story as much as any adult loved a scandal, would sneak up the ridge at dusk hoping to catch a glimpse of her. But she never scolded or chased them. Instead, she'd hand them a flower, sometimes a sage blossom, sometimes a sprig of rosemary, and tell them to remember kindness, because it lasts longer than names. With time, the town stopped calling her Clara Hawthorne, and even Clara Mercer faded into something more like the widow on the hill. The story became a legend, retold in the general store and around campfires, reshaped by each mouth that spoke it. A lonely cowboy who bought a woman for $1 and found his soul in the bargain. A scarred widow who redeemed a whole town by refusing to vanish into shame. A pair of broken souls who proved that mercy still had a place in the desert. By then, most of the people who had known them were gone, buried in the same earth she tended with such care. But the oak remained, its roots deep and strong, and each spring it dropped acorns that grew stubborn in the hard soil, as if the land itself had learned how to heal. One evening, a passing preacher stopped by her cabin and found her sitting by the window, the light falling warm across her face, the Bible open to a page so worn it was nearly unreadable. She looked up and smiled when he asked if she was alone out here. "Never," she said simply, and her eyes flicked toward the hill. The preacher later told folks in town that her voice had carried something eternal in it, like forgiveness that had finally found rest. And when she was gone, when the cabin stood empty and the wind reclaimed the doorway, they buried her beside him under the same oak tree. No inscription this time, only 2 silver coins pressed into the dirt where her hands should be. The travelers still come, standing quiet before the twin graves, and they always say the same thing when they leave, that Eli Mercer's dollar bought more than a woman. It bought redemption, for her, for him, and maybe, in some small, lasting way, for everyone who still believes that love can bloom even in the hardest soil. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.